The scorching summer of 1882 swept across the dusty plains of Colorado. The wind lifted the dirt in waves in which it felt possible to lose everything: the past, hope, even oneself. On the horizon, a man could barely be seen, holding the reins of a weary horse, with a small child sitting quietly beside him. Their faces were tired, their eyes full of anticipation for something they did not yet understand. They were heading to a town where no one knew them, where fate could turn gentle or cruel. This story is not about money or power. It is about hearts finding each other after pain, and how a family is born on a dusty road. If you want to follow stories about people who choose care, trust, and love, stay with Dust and Devotion Tales. The heat pressed down on the land as the plains stretched endlessly ahead, broken only by dry grass and low ridges of stone. The man moved steadily forward, guiding the tired horse with practiced care, his posture rigid from long hours on the road. Each step stirred dust that clung to his boots and coat, a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had left behind. The child beside him sat quietly, small hands resting on a worn blanket, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something familiar in a place that offered none. The man had once known comfort, laughter, and a home filled with voices. Those things now lived only in memory, carried like extra weight in his chest. Since his wife's death, the world had narrowed to responsibility and survival. Every mile he traveled was measured not in distance, but in endurance. He rose before dawn, pushed forward through the heat, and rested only when the child's strength faltered. Grief had taught him discipline, and love kept him moving when his body wanted to stop. The plains showed no mercy. Water was scarce, shade even more so. Wind swept across the land without warning, carrying grit that stung the eyes and dried the mouth. Still, the man did not curse the land. He accepted it the way he accepted his loss, quietly and without complaint. He believed hardship was something meant to be carried, not argued with. As the day wore on, the child's small movements slowed, and the man adjusted his pace, shortening the distance between rest stops. He watched closely for signs of exhaustion, knowing the land could take the weak without warning. Protecting the child had become his purpose, the one clear thing left to him. In that duty, he found a fragile sense of meaning. By late afternoon, the outline of a distant town began to form, faint and uncertain through the haze. It was nothing more than a suggestion of buildings against the sky, but it drew his attention like a promise. Towns meant water, shelter, and the chance to stop moving for a while. They also meant people, and people carried risk. The man had learned to be cautious, to observe before trusting, to keep his past hidden. As they moved closer, the land softened slightly, the grass less brittle, the air carrying the faint scent of life. The man felt a quiet shift inside himself, something between relief and fear. He did not know what waited ahead, only that turning back was no longer an option. The road behind them had already taken too much. He tightened his grip on the reins and guided the horse forward, his shadow stretching long across the ground. Whatever awaited them in that town would have to be faced the same way he faced the plains, step by step, with resolve born from loss and a hope he refused to name. The town rose gently from the edge of the plains, tucked against the foothills where the mountains began to gather their strength. Fall Creek carried the sound of a distant bell and the warm scent of baked bread drifting through the dusty air. Wooden buildings leaned slightly with age, their facades sun-bleached and worn, as if they had learned to endure rather than resist the land around them. People moved at an unhurried pace, shaped by heat and habit, their footsteps soft against the dirt-packed street. James guided the horse through town with measured care, his gaze steady but alert. He took in the details without lingering, the way a man did when he wished to remain unnoticed. His clothes were plain, his posture unassuming. and nothing about him suggested the life he had once lived. Experience had taught him that quiet drew less attention than confidence, and he preferred to let the town reveal itself before deciding how long he might stay. Near the center of Fall Creek, he noticed a woman standing beside a small market stall. Anna Morgan leaned over a basket of vegetables, her movements efficient but careful, as if every gesture had been practiced to conserve energy. A young girl stood close to her side, fingers wrapped around the edge of the woman's skirt. Eliza's eyes followed the world with cautious curiosity, absorbing faces and motion without fear, yet never straying far from the safety of her mother's presence. James slowed without meaning to. There was a tension in Anna's shoulders that he recognized immediately, the kind that came from responsibility carried alone. Her back was straight, but not relaxed, and her attention shifted constantly between her child and the space around them. She was not simply shopping. She was watching, calculating, protecting. It was the posture of someone who could not afford mistakes. He felt something stir in his chest, unexpected and unwelcome. It was not desire nor hope, but a quiet awareness that this woman lived under a weight similar to his own. She too was shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Whatever her story was, it had taught her to stand her ground while remaining unseen. The child beside her reminded him why that tension existed. Eliza's presence anchored Anna, just as the small child traveling with James anchored him. Parenthood had stripped away illusions and left only essentials: safety, food, shelter, tomorrow. Watching them together awakened a familiar instinct in him, the same one that guided his decisions on the road. Protection came first. Everything else followed. James continued forward, resisting the urge to look back. He knew better than to allow interest to become attachment too quickly. Towns were temporary. People were complicated. Still, the image of the woman and her child lingered with him as he moved deeper into Fall Creek. The mountains loomed quietly beyond the rooftops, steady and unmoving, as if bearing silent witness to lives unfolding beneath them. By the time he reached the far end of the street, James understood one thing with unsettling clarity. This town was not as simple as it appeared, and neither was the woman he had seen. Something about Fall Creek pressed against him, awakening caution and a pull he could not yet explain, as though the road had led him here for reasons he had not planned to face. The calm surface of Fall Creek began to show its fractures as the day wore on. Beneath the familiar rhythms of work and routine, certain men moved with a sense of entitlement, their presence heavy and unwelcome. James sensed it before he saw it, the shift in the air that came when power was misused and silence was expected in return. He noticed the way people looked away, how steps quickened when certain figures approached, how unease traveled faster than words ever could. Near the edge of town, the tension finally revealed itself. Anna stood rigid, her posture no longer simply cautious but defensive, as if she were bracing against something she had endured before. A man loomed too close, his body angled to block her path, his presence deliberate and invasive. The threat was unspoken yet unmistakable, hanging heavy in the space between them. It was not just land or property being questioned, but her safety and the fragile future she was trying to protect for her child. James moved without hesitation. He placed himself between them, his stance grounded and controlled, a quiet barrier that required no explanation. There was no anger in his expression, no show of dominance. His calm was deliberate, sharpened by experience, and it carried a warning more effective than raised fists ever could. Every line of his posture spoke of restraint held firmly in place. Behind him, Samuel remained close, small hands clutching fabric, his body pressed near the only solid thing he trusted. Fear widened the boy's eyes, yet something else flickered there as well, a fragile sense of awe at the steadiness of the man who stood unmoving in the face of danger. To Samuel, strength was no longer loud or frightening. It was quiet, certain, and protective. James did not rush. He adjusted his position with careful precision, each movement economical and intentional. Years of hardship had taught him that control mattered more than force, and that real power did not need to announce itself. The man before him sensed it too, the shift in balance that made intimidation suddenly feel uncertain. For the first time in a long while, Anna felt the weight on her shoulders ease. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her breath steadied, her hands relaxed at her sides. She realized that the man standing in front of her was not seeking advantage, gratitude, or obedience. He was simply there, holding the line because it needed to be held. Something changed in her gaze as she watched him. Caution softened into something warmer, something she had not allowed herself to feel. Trust, fragile and unfamiliar, began to take shape. In that moment, she understood that protection did not always come with demands. Sometimes it came quietly, without conditions, offered by someone who knew what it meant to lose and still chose to stand firm. The shadow that had followed her for so long did not disappear, but it retreated, just enough to let her feel the light again. And as James remained steady between threat and safety, Fall Creek bore witness to a shift that neither of them yet understood. The beginning of a bond forged not by words, but by presence and resolve. The tension left behind by the earlier confrontation lingered in the air, settling over Fall Creek like dust after a passing storm. James felt the weight of unfinished truths pressing against him, heavier than the road he had traveled. He had learned long ago that silence could be both a shield and a burden, and now it was time to decide which it would be. What he revealed shifted the ground beneath them. The careful image he had worn began to fall away, replaced by the reality of who he was and what he held. Ownership of land, wide pastures stretching beyond the foothills, cattle moving like dark rivers across open range. The truth was not spoken lightly, and it was not offered as leverage. It was given because concealment no longer served the purpose of safety. Anna absorbed the revelation slowly. Surprise passed through her first, followed by a cautious reassessment of the man before her. Wealth carried meaning in places like Fall Creek. It could open doors or sharpen resentment. She felt both relief and restraint take hold at once. Knowing he had resources softened the edge of danger, yet it also awakened old instincts that warned her not to mistake money for certainty. Around them, the town took notice. Curious glances followed James more closely now, measuring him against the rumors that had begun to form. Some faces held admiration, others calculation, and a few reflected envy, thinly disguised as indifference. Power changed how people looked at a man, and James understood that better than most. Visibility invited attention, and attention invited challenge. Despite her concerns, Anna felt something ease within her. The threat that had once felt constant now seemed slightly less immediate. There was comfort in knowing that someone nearby had the means to stand firm when pressure came. Yet with that comfort came a new unease. She had lived long enough under uncertainty to know that influence attracted its own kind of danger. James sensed the conflict stirring in her, and it shaped his own resolve. Protection, he realized, was not defined by strength or wealth alone. It required the creation of a space where fear did not govern every decision, a place where a child could grow without watching shadows too closely, and where a woman could breathe without bracing for the next blow. As the sun dipped lower behind the mountains, casting long lines of shadow across the town, James understood what his path demanded of him. Guarding bodies was only the beginning. What truly mattered was offering stability, consistency, and the promise of a life not ruled by survival. In revealing his past, he had taken a risk, but it was one he was willing to bear if it meant building something safer than silence ever could. Fall Creek remained watchful, uncertain of what this change would bring. But for Anna, the world had shifted just enough to suggest a future not entirely shaped by fear. And for James, the truth had drawn a clear line between who he had been and the man he was choosing to become. The river moved steadily through the valley, its surface catching light between the shadows of tall pines. The air was cooler there, carrying the scent of water and earth, a quiet contrast to the dust and tension of town. James watched as the children explored the bank, their movements unburdened, guided by curiosity rather than caution. Samuel focused on the water with patient determination, casting small lines and tossing stones that skipped briefly before disappearing beneath the surface. Eliza moved freely between the trees, her laughter rising and falling like birdsong, light and unrestrained. Anna remained close at first, her attention divided between the children and the man beside her. Habit kept her alert, her posture careful even in moments meant for rest. Yet the longer the day unfolded, the more the tightness in her shoulders eased. The river did not demand vigilance, and neither did James. His presence was steady, unobtrusive, offering space rather than expectation. James felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper within him. It was no longer only about standing between danger and those who needed protection. It was about allowing room for joy without fear of its cost. He saw it in the way Anna's gaze softened when the children laughed, and in the brief moments when she allowed herself to simply watch rather than prepare for interruption. The children changed first. Their laughter grew louder, their movements bolder. Samuel's careful focus gave way to moments of excitement, and Eliza's steps became lighter as she moved without hesitation. James observed these small shifts with quiet awareness, understanding how rare such ease could be when life had taught them caution too early. As the afternoon passed, Anna began to breathe more freely. She no longer flinched at sudden sounds or scanned the distance for signs of trouble. Instead, she allowed herself to sit beneath the pines, letting the quiet wrap around her. Trust did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, built from moments that asked nothing in return: a shared silence, a watchful presence, the absence of pressure. James recognized the significance of those moments. He had learned that bonds were not forged through promises or declarations, but through consistency, through showing up, staying present, and offering care without condition. Watching Anna and the children, he understood that family was taking shape not through words, but through the steady accumulation of safety and warmth. As the light shifted and the day began to fade, something settled between them. It was fragile but real. Anna allowed herself to believe that this peace might not vanish the moment she reached for it. James carried that belief quietly, aware that what he was protecting now was not just bodies, but the delicate return of laughter and the possibility of a life shaped by trust rather than fear. Morning settled over Fall Creek with a gentleness that felt almost unfamiliar. The light crept slowly across the rooftops, warming the dust-packed streets and softening the sharp lines of the buildings. The town seemed to pause in that quiet hour, suspended between what had been and what was still forming. James moved through it with a steady pace, carrying the weight of decisions made, not in haste, but in careful reflection. When he reached Anna and Eliza, he saw everything she had not tried to hide. The strain of sleepless nights lingered beneath her eyes, and the tension of years spent guarding herself had not fully left her posture. Yet beneath that weariness lived something unbroken. Resolve shaped her expression now, a calm strength that came from surviving what should have crushed her. She stood not as someone waiting to be saved, but as someone choosing what came next. James understood the significance of that choice. He did not approach with certainty or promises of ease. He came with intention, offering a life built not on grand assurances, but on daily presence. The step he took toward them was measured and deliberate, carrying the unspoken offer of shared mornings, shared burdens, and shared responsibility. It was not an escape from hardship, but a commitment to face it together. The children felt the shift immediately. Samuel's hesitation faded as familiarity replaced uncertainty, and he moved closer without fear. Eliza followed with a natural trust shaped by the safety she had already felt. Their acceptance was unspoken, instinctive, rooted in the simple understanding that this man had stayed when it mattered. In their small gestures lived the truth James held closest. Trust was not demanded, it was earned. As the day began to unfold, James felt a stillness settle deep within him. It was not the absence of risk or the certainty of peace, but something steadier, hope, grounded and quiet. For the first time since his loss, the future did not feel like an empty stretch of road. It felt shared. Whatever came next would not be faced alone. Anna watched him closely, allowing herself to remain in the moment rather than retreat into caution. She did not rush forward, nor did she pull away. Instead, she stayed, letting the weight of the decision rest where it belonged. In that stillness, she felt the subtle relief of no longer carrying everything by herself. The fear that had shaped her days did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. Around them, Fall Creek resumed its gentle rhythm. A door opened somewhere down the street. Footsteps passed in the distance. A breeze lifted dust into the air before letting it drift back to the ground. Life continued quietly, indifferent to the significance of what was forming in that small space. Yet within that ordinary setting, something lasting took root. James looked at the children, at the way their movements had grown lighter, their laughter easier. He recognized that family was not defined by beginnings, but by care sustained over time. It was built through consistency, through protection offered without demand, through the courage to remain when leaving would be easier. What stood before him now was not a perfect future, but a real one. As the light shifted and the morning warmed, the moment lingered. Smiles appeared without effort. Laughter carried softly on the air. The wind moved through the streets as it always had, yet it seemed gentler now, as if acknowledging the change it could not name. In that quiet space, a family began, not with ceremony, but with choice. For those drawn to stories where hearts find one another through patience, resilience, and care, and where families are formed even in the harshest places, subscribing to Dust and Devotion Tales allows these journeys to continue, one quiet beginning at a time.